Sea King. Ancient coastal Trollkin creoles performed primeval ceremonies to summon troll kings from the sea to destroy their enemies. The drums and chants of entire villages rolled across the waters and into the depths to reach the ears of the slumbering sea kings and rouse them to wrath. These enormous marine beasts were called from the tides only when there was no alternatives, as the kin could well be devoured alongside their enemies. Creoles forgot their rights over time, and the Sea Kings vanished into legend. Each established a lair many leagues from Imoran's coastlines, hunting the nearby waters and occasionally waging titanic battles in the deep with other great leviathans. At times they approached the surface to attack passing ships, smashing holes with their great fists and devouring crews that fell screaming into the water. Ship graveyards served as their lairs, and the ocean floors littered with holes cracked open in search of anything worth eating. Tales tell of stretches of ocean that swallow a ship's hull. Experienced sailors avoid these perilous expanses even in the cost of speed and supplies, though there is no shortage of fools seeking faster routes. These poor souls meet unsavory ends as the briny waters erupt and their ships are torn asunder. Sea Kings have evolved in different ways from their surface kin, able to endure longer between feasting. One notable adaptation is that they possess not one stomach, but two. First digest whale flesh and doom sailors, while the second serves akin to the spare holding tank to carry them through the lean times. A Sea King will glut itself amid swarms of prey, and small creatures swallowed whole remain alive and undigested in the self-contained habitat of its innards. The Sea King has learned to make aggressive use of its food reserves, vomiting up the chitinous swarms in a stream of salt water and partially digested meat. These crabs grab and slice anything in reach, amid panicked effort to escape consumption. After annihilating its foes, the Sea King eats anything left behind. When Harlock Doomshaper awakened the Troll Kings, the Sea Kings also heard his ritual call and felt compelled to wander closer to shore. Creoles who live near the sea have resumed the old ways. Fell callers have raised their voices alongside the pounding of great drums to enlist the Sea Kings again, bringing these horrors from the deep against their enemies. And talk about sea monsters, because this thing is terrifying. And unlike its Mountain King cousin, this guy has a ship on its back. So if you're not really aware and you see a shipwreck out on the coast, it could be one of these things just hanging out in the water waiting for you to get over to it. And eats everything, and two stomachs, one that keeps its food alive and the other for digestion. And that is a terrifying proposition, to get eaten by one of these things but not be killed outright and just have to wait until he feels like, eating you. Terrifying. But let's read over his Mark III to Mark IV changes and see how this giant Trollkin sea monster has changed over the Mark III to Mark IV changes. I can't imagine much, since I think he is relatively new. And I believe in the new Mark IV they have another one of these guys. So even scarier in that account as well, because that means that these guys are not just myth, they are still out in the open. And as always, let's start with our stat line. He is a speed 5, he is a mat 6, he is a rat 5, defense 9, armor 19, fury 5, threshold 6. His abilities have breakthrough, slam, trample, headbutt, pathfinder. He is also a gladiator, much like the Glacier King. He has dual attack, and he has amphibious, so when he is in water, he disappears and he no longer blocks line of sight. So if you can get him into a very heavily watered area, because he probably needs a relatively big pond, you can see right through him, and then he gains concealment while he's in there. So very, very terrifying for anybody that has to go up against this guy if he's in the water. His special abilities are pretty basic. He has bulldoze like all the rest of the kings. When this model is base to base with an enemy model during its normal movement, it can push that model up to 2 inches directly away from it. A model can be pushed by bulldoze only once per turn. Bulldoze has no effect when this model makes a trample power attack. And then he also has snacking, because he is a troll. When this model boxes a living enemy model with a melee attack, it can choose to remove that model from play. And when it does, he can remove a D3 damage points. So very terrifying on that aspect. Still pretty basic though. Let's read over his fun weapons. We'll start with his Vomit Swarm, as we read about in the archives. Alright, Vomit Swarm, Rat 5, range 10, rate of fire 1, AoE 3, so it's an AoE, power 13, 7. This is he does have the ability to shoot in melee, and this causes corrosion, which makes sense since it's vomit. Also, on top of that, it is poisonous. So, special ability, Poison. Gain an additional die on this weapon's damage against living models. So, he automatically gains an additional die, and then you can boost it on top. So, you can give this guy an additional 4 dice of damage instead of the traditional 2 if he's attacking a living model, which is terrifying. And you can hit that model hit plus an additional 3 models within 3 inches. Pretty dang wide splat. Looks like he did lose. Because of the Mark 3 to Mark 4 changes, he lost something called Scuttering Swarm. After determining the point of impact, roll a deviation for 1 additional 3-inch AoE at that point. On a roll of 1 or 2, the AoE deviates in the direction of 1. On a roll of 3 or 4, it deviates in the direction of 2. And on a roll of 5 or 6, it deviates in the direction of 6. A model hit with the additional AoE suffers a POW 7 blast damage roll and corrosion continuous effect. I can understand why that was removed in Mark 4, just because, 1, we no longer use AoEs, and we no longer use scatter templates, because, well, scattering is no longer a thing in Mark 4 to speed up the game dramatically, so that's probably why that has been removed. Let's move on to his next weapons. He is one of the few, well, he's, I think, the only Mountain King who actually uses real weapons, at least in Mark 3. We'll start with his Big Meaty Fist, one of his hands, one Big Meaty Fist. A Mat 6, range 2, POW 19, pretty standard for these guys. But he also carries an anchor in the other hand. And the anchor is a Mat 6, range 3, because it has a chain on it, and it is a chain weapon, so it ignores shields. And it's a POW 21. See how much more dangerous they are with weapons? And on this one, he has critical knockdown, so on a crit, especially if you're fishing for crits, you can actually have him knock down the enemy and then just go ham. Hammering blow after blow with your... Well, I imagine you're going to be keep hitting him with the anchor, so that actually makes sense. But it does make him a lot more melee beastly as well. Let's go over his animus here. It's called Vortex of the Deep. Same thing it was called. It was called in the last one. Although there has been some variations to this guy. And let's see if we can find those variations. In Mark 3, on a direct hit, push models within 2 inches of the model directly hit, 2 inches directly towards it in the order you choose, and the spell's AoE is Shallow Water and remains in play for 1 round. So that doesn't sound too bad. I imagine this is probably setting up for a AoE shot from his Poison Venom Swarm cannon. But let's read what the Mark 4 changes on this guy have done. So it is a Vortex of the Deep, cost 2, range star, interesting, duration round, and non-offensive. So, Vortex of the Deep. Place a 3-inch template anywhere completely within 10 inches of the spellcaster. The template is shallow water terrain and remains in play for 1 round. While in the template, a model gains resistance to fire. Ooh, that's interesting. I'm curious if every shallow water template gives the model resistance to fire. I imagine it's still a good thing to have. Well... Yeah, and it says while in the template, so it doesn't say while completely within, so even if you're towing it, I imagine that still is done up. So that's a little different from Vortex of the Deep. So all the new one does is just you're allowed to place a 3-inch template anywhere completely within 10 inches of the spellcaster. Very useful, so if you just want to have some shallow water terrain for a round, there you go. And then if you need that resistance to fire, like if you're going up against somebody, say like the Protectorate, who use fire a lot, resistance to fire is going to be a very, very useful thing for you outright. So that's interesting. So I guess they just went from a vortex pool to just a standard shallow water template. But I feel like the new Mark IV one actually makes more sense and allows you a little bit more use. Because like being able to push models together in a cluster is cool and all, but with the AoE changes and stuff like that, it's not like as useful as it was back in the day. But yeah, so this guy is a lot more of a pretty beastly melee combatant, and his AoE does pretty significant amount of damage. Now, Is it as good as damage as like the Mountain King with his spray doing a 16? Maybe not, but get an additional die on living models if you're going up against a lot of living models like other hordes factions or stuff like that. I could see his use as a lot. And also him having the gladiator ability, any of his power attacks do an additional 2 damage on that, is always going to be pretty dang useful. So I see the Sea King as a very, well, I imagine every model you take is useful in one way or the other. And just this guy being able to give out resist to fire makes him even more useful in the long term. And his anchor actually went up quite a bit from his Mark II counterpoint, so his anchor is still super useful for a melee weapon. But